I stand here with 2 other palfrey horses at the entrance of the cave. The other horses show fear at me. It's understandable, as I am my wolf form by them. They are tethered so that they are forced to hold this spot. Together, we are bait for the Wyrm. I wear a palfrey skin hide over myself to act as camouflage for what we attempt. We wait for the Wyrm to come snatch me. Once snatched, then we'll see, I suppose. But before we continue, let us travel back in time to earlier this day.
Alas! Alas, fair William!
Yes, Percy was in full flow, arms raised to the sky.
A once beautiful and brave man!
His hands now swinging in a huge dramatic display of drama, in a dramatic, drama-driven way to the body on the floor.
Verily, verily, we look upon the husk that was once your soul's home, despondent with grief.
Percy decried. Yes, decried is a good description of how Percy delivered this speech.
Death has him mounted upon his skeletal steed, ready for his final journey to paradise, which one as worthy as him deserves. But not yet, I beg you, not yet, he is too young.
Carried on Percy in full flow for this monologue as if he had a great crowd to watch this performance, which he did not.
I say, Percy,
said Gervais.
Do not let that unworthy wraith take him from us, God!
Percy paused, wiping his eyes with a kerchief.
I say once more, Percy.
Again, Gervais tried to gain Percy's attention.
He was brave enough to face the beast. Can you not see that? Damn you!
Percy continued.
Percy!
Shouted Gervais.
The very demon monster that was sent by Satan himself from the very bowels of the fiery pit.
Gervais now grabbed Percy's shoulder.
Percy!
Percy fell to his knees, slipping from Gervais' grip.
He saved us, God, at the highest cost that any man could pay for such bravery. I pray for him now that his journey is fair, and that the angels welcome him and bow to him with the honour that befits a man so brave, so brave.
He fell forward onto his face, beating his fists on the ground, over-crying. Yes, over-crying. A new word that befits what Percy was doing here. Now, Gervais stood over the prone Percy with folded arms until the sobs and wails stopped. Llywelyn, my squire, Welly as we called him, looked on the scene open-mouthed.
Have you finished?
Percy got to his hands and knees, wiping his eyes before rising to his feet.
Not quite yet, Gervais. If I had a cap, I would doff it to you. Safe journey, our proud William.
He whispered, looking at the sky hand on heart. Welly, still open-mouthed, followed the grieving man's gaze, trying to see what he was focused on while taking his own hand to his own heart. This was done out of a state of confusion more than any sense of grief that he might have felt.
Percy! What, Gervais? What? Can't you see that my veritable heart is broken with the pain? The pain!
Screeched Percy at Gervais.
Percy? William is, still with us. He lives.
Replied Gervais.
Oh, is he? Oh, good.
smiled the once broken man.
Although he might wish otherwise when he smells what he's lying in. It is, with little wants that I will attend him, to be honest,
said Gervais, looking at the body coated in the regurgitated mess in which the dragon had coated the night. They now gathered around the moaning body on the ground in its pool of indescribable nastiness. I was slowly, and yet again with a clanging head, waking. This manner of awakening into a world of misery was beginning to become a commonplace awakening for me, an unfortunate awakening to grim, soldierly faces looking down upon me. The daylight was blinding, and it took a while for the silhouettes of the heads to become clear. They were helmetless, and all of them had a rag of cloth to their nose and mouth. Why were they trying to mask themselves from me? No. Had I been knocked nonsensical and landed behind the lines of an enemy?
No, William. We were trying to kill a dragon,
said the wolf soul, quite matter-of-factly. His tone was always such, I suppose, but this particular subject should warrant more. Although hearing Fenrir's voice was comforting, and with his aid, the memory of the last few hours returned to me. Ah, yes. We had caught a dragon on a chain outside his cave with a bull as bait. That seems like a straightforward and easy thing to say and understand, does it not? We'd been sent to kill this creature, and to say that we were unprepared would be a massive underestimation. The massive part of that sentence being the nature of the beast. It was well to keep on a theme of massive size, it was. It was, after all, massive. What else did I recall? Ah, yes, the dragon's peculiar ability. When it stood still, it vanished from sight. How could such a colossal creature, I mean it was a true behemoth, manage to disappear into thin air? No wonder these creatures were rarely seen. How had the wolf soul seen it when it was in the cave? Could it become invisible at its will?
William! Are you dead, William? You seem to be, moving and breathing. It's, very different from the crushed form that you were just, a few moments ago. You now seem to be in somewhat rude health. Well, that is apart from the incredibly melodious pool that you lie in,
Gervais said.
I hold my stomach. I've never tasted a stench like that. I'm very close to adding to the pool of vomit that you lie in.
He hacked. The last face I recognized was my squire, Wally. He did not speak, but had a green tinge to him that I assumed was caused by the... Oh, for the sake of the saints, what the hell am I lying in? The fetid stink of the pool was like nothing I had ever smelt before. It burnt my lungs and brought me significant nausea to my squirming bowels. The three men unceremoniously grabbed me, Gervais and Welly with gusto. Percy was a wee bit timorous in his actions, if I'm entirely honest, trying to find an unfouled, liquid-free spot on my body to help lift me. But he gave up and held my soaked gambon with disgust as they dragged me away from the pool. We had slowly made a base camp some distance from the cave site, a spot where horses and baggage lay. Once there, Welly helped me from armor and cloth so that I could wash as much of this mess from me as possible. I had entered an icy cold stream alongside our campground. I sat waist deep, letting the soothing water run over me. It was bitingly cold, but revived my spirit and my body a little. It was welcome, that cold, as it shocked me back into the world that I knew. My fellows sat on the bank, Gervais drinking, as was his wont, Percy chewing on a piece of grass, and Welly trying to remove the dragon's stomach contents from my kit, with little success.
So, William?
Asked Percy. It was an inquiring tone, as if a question.
So, William?
I could tell that he was going to say something that gave him discomfort in doing so.
Even a brave man such as yourself has to admit that we can't fight that demon. How can 3 mere men prevail against such a thing? Be serious in your thinking here. It could have killed us at will, if God had not been on our side.
I washed and rinsed my hair several times, then lay back in the flow, allowing the water to fully cover my body and face, to use its powerful current to cleanse the last rudiments of the beast's bile from my skin. I had to think. This would take some time. I felt a mix of emotions, fear, frustration, and a lingering sense of failure. Eventually, sitting up and getting to my feet, I smiled at Welly, who stood with fresh linen with which I could dry myself and try and rub some heat back into my now numb limbs. My wolf soul was relaxing on a bank at a little distance. I sensed his dismay at what had happened and the fact that he was deep in thought. He lay on his belly, stretched out to full length. His head rested on his front paws, and he looked as concerned as a wolf could look. I could hear him contemplating the nature of the worm inside his head. I could also sense that he had nothing that could help us, as of yet. Fenrir, how on earth do we slay this thing? Have you come across them before in your long years? I asked. The great black shadow of the wolf lifted his head and looked in my direction.
Aye. I've heard of them. I've seen them, but never once so closely. In the evenings in Runtsgard, far to the north, back in there, drakes would often be seen, playing in the sky. They would fly, and we would watch them as they chased each other's tails. It was a most magnificent sight to behold, but they looked to be only the size of a large horse. They were beautiful to behold, and they did not bother the people apart from stealing odd beasts from their tended herds. The tribes who lived there did not mind this. They thought it was a small cost to see these wonderful worms, and believed that they offered a sort of protection to the village in payment for animals. They were incredible and offered fright, but were not such as this in this cave. Our quarry is a giant amongst them, to be sure.
He told me. I walked to the fire that Gervais was especially thankful to have. It still may not have been safe for us to have an open flame at this distance from the dragon's lair, but our little party seemed to care not at this moment. The reward of warmth and the warding off of the flies was a boon that I much appreciated at this point as I wedged the cloth in my ear to remove the last of the water that lay there. The atmosphere around our little fire was grim, it was, and the party now went into an uncomfortable silence as we considered what to do next. Should we return to the noble Count's court and tell him about our failure? Should we continue with what seemed like an impossible task? A task that I could only see our deaths at the end of? Removing ourselves back to the Count's court did not sit well with me at all. Once dried and robed, I sat on a handy log by the fire. Something bubbled in a pot over it, and it smelled good to me, it did. To this, a ravenous man. My eyes met Welly's.
It's beef,
He said. Of course it was, I smiled in response.
It seemed wrong to waste all that good flesh.
Laughed Welly as he stood up and got something from our baggage. A few moments later, my squire pushed a flagon of rough red wine into my hand, and I emptied it in silence, staring at the bottom of the now empty vessel. There was no chatter, no discussion of the day. This was time to process what had happened. Over the next few decades, I learned to recognize moments like this. I had learned that the length of time I and others sat in silence and contemplation on a subject reflected the difficulty of the task we were to undertake. By the time many of us were ready for conversation, the sun was at its zenith, and its warmth fell upon us, making life seem a little better as the four of us sat eating. Gervais broke the silence.
What now?
He asked as though one of us had an idea of what to do. I knew he looked at me for an answer, but at this point, I did not have one.
I cannot see a way in which we can fight that creature. I don't see how an army could kill it. Your sword, William, just merely scratched its surface. It dinted its scales a bit, but it did no real damage. Then, now look at us. We ran like the frightened children we were. So unworthy of us, I know.
However we looked at it, he was right. How could we hurt this beast? Mere mortals did not seem to have enough power or weapons to do so. Luckily for our little party, I was no mere mortal. I was a werewolf. And as that creature may have a way to deal with the worm, although at this point, I had no idea how I, in my most terrible aspect, could bloody harm that thing. Wally was sat by the fire, his brow knotted and poking the flames whilst watching the pot. Silence again, until this time, Wally spoke.
Sir, can I offer an idea? I'm sorry, it's sort of beyond me, isn't it? I shouldn't really say these things,
He said. I smiled, and we all turned our heads to him. His face was now filled with more fear than he had shown the face of the dragon. Go ahead, say it, I told the boy. You are as much a part of this as any of us, and to be frank, none of us have any way to defeat this worm. We may as well cure it. Gervais took yet another drink from his cup, smiled and nodded at the boy to try to comfort him before speaking.
Go ahead, boy. It cannot be as foolish as the plan we had today, Welly. Let us go fishing for dragon with a bull on a chain. With hindsight, it was not the greatest of ideas, was it?
He said, and sobbed.
But I suppose one hell of a story if we return to court.
Percy and I laughed at the truth of this. What had we been thinking?
Are you sure?
Wally asked. He was now enthusiastic at our interest. He seemed to grow in size and maturity as he began to speak.
Well, you see, sirs, I have a cunning plan. A most cunning plan.
He smiled and looked to each of us to gauge our interest.
Master Theatre, well, you know, the kennel man, has a very interesting way of killing rats that haunt his doghouse.
He paused for dramatic effect, nodding as he did so.
Yes, you have my interest, young man. Get on with it,
Said Percy.
I'm sure you'll be able to guess what it is.
Asked Wally.
Well, boy, I've seen the mangy one-eared ginger moggy down there and about there, but I don't think we can find a cat big enough for the beastie, although that tomcat is one vicious little bastard, I've heard. Maybe we can bring him to the battle as an aid.
He laughed at his own jest, expecting us to join, but not one of us found it amusing, although the wolf soul smirked in my mind. Please do not leave us in suspense any longer, Wally. Tell us about the Ratman's methods.
Well, he poisons them with orpiment.
He told us, sitting back expecting some kind of congratulations for this information. We were silent. In Wally's mind, this meant that he had to give us more when, really, he did not.
He places it in bait, and then they eat it and die. Horrible in bloated agony. It's awful.
His face showed disgust at this.
He also threatens me with the same fate if I don't leave his daughter alone.
He smiled.
Well, boy, do we have half a ton of orpiment with us in our baggage by any chance?
Asked Gervais, a little sarcastically. Welly looked at the man in deep thought as though going through an itinerary of the items in our baggage.
No.
He said with a miserable air, showing much despondency with his body language.
I foresee a basic problem with such a plan then, my boy,
said Gervais. The boy hung his head and looked sad. It would have been a great plan if we had the material required, I told the boy, not wanting to feel a moon calf for his suggestion.
Personally, I think the boy has a splendid idea. Can we not think of something to replace the poison? Maybe this substance you call wine, William.
Percy asked. Again we spent time in thought about this. What would nature have in the woods that could be used as a poison for such a beast? Sadly, being knights and not witches or wise men or apothecaries, we had no clue about the poisonous plants of the wilds. And then, quite suddenly, the answer came to me. Does it have to be poison to kill the beast? It is armored well on the outside, it is, but I wonder if it is so well protected on the inside. The other men looked at me, confused.
I don't really understand what you mean, Will. Do you mean we will fill its stomach with sharp objects and hope that they kill it? I don't think that can be done, can it? Firstly, we don't have enough steel to do so. And secondly, how would we get the worm to eat it? I don't think it will sleep soundly enough for us to force it in the night. And I don't think it will swallow it down if we ask nicely.
He laughed at the ridiculous idea that he'd come up with.
Well, I think if we were even to get sharp steel in it, maybe through a baited sheep or horse, the worm would just regurgitate it as before. I don't think that it would die, but we have only this option if we're going to continue. We cannot fight it head on, so do we try?
Said Gervais. Again, silence as we all considered this idea. Well, actually, there is something that we can get inside him that would do the damage. Something that could rip and shred the internals of that beast. Fenrir looked at me as I talked. His mind was warning me about going down this path. He knew that I meant to reveal to these precious few, these men that I trusted above all others, that I was able to become the Wolfman. I'd got their attention now. All eyes were on me as I rose from my seat on the log and turned my back to them. This was going to be a dangerous reveal. If I did this, I could not undo it, and my secret, which might also become my downfall, would be out. How would they take it? Would they think that I was bewitched or mad or a demon? I was going to tell them a semi-awful truth. I would tell them that I could become this demonic black shadow, this beast with sharp claws and ravening teeth. It could culminate in them fearing me and running from me. It could lead to my best and only friends denouncing me, and from there, being burnt at the stake and excommunicated. I looked at the wolf soul, my invisible friend, but he offered no succor and no support.
It's by your own hands if you decide to do this, William. Just your choice.
I stood and walked a little from the fire with my back to them as I thought about how to deliver this news, this truth, this awful truth. How would they deal with it? How could they comprehend that I was what I was? I breathed deeply and prepared myself.
So, I guess at this point,
You're going to tell us you can become the Wolfman.
Gervais interrupted my preparation. What? I froze.
I beg your forgiveness. Sorry, William, but your indecision has become a little bit dull, and we need to press ahead if we are going to do anything. I do not mean to steal your limelight, your thunder, but, we know.
He told me. I turned to Gervais and Percy.
Yes, I'm afraid it's true, William. We have, known about your, furry condition for some time.
Said Percy, smiling. My face must have been funny to behold because they all burst into laughter.
Yes, please forgive us, but we have known you for a big part of your life since we were children. So we first thought that you played at having an invisible friend, but as you grew, we thought that you had gone quite mad. And as we got older, we still thought we might, that you might be possessed or something, but it did not seem like an evil possession to us. The friend that we could not see never seemed to do any harm to those who did not deserve such, to be honest, William.
Continued Percy.
Yes, and then there were the nights you simply disappeared and no one knew where you were. People saw a gigantic wolf, or part man, part wolf, in the keeping castle. These sightings always seemed to coincide with you not being there, if you know what I mean. Not difficult to draw conclusions. Then there were the mysterious things happening to those who were, let us say, not your friends. It was also the description of the assailant in all these cases that made it somewhat evident, let's say. Oh, yes, and yes, don't forget that you seem to be able to heal from the most horrendous injuries. I personally thought and told those close to the God must have blessed you. Then you took that blade through the thigh muscle. I saw it shatter the bones, and the blood loss was horrendous. William, people do not heal in an hour from a wound such as that, I'm afraid.
Interrupted Gervais.
Oh, yes, and Fenrir is not an imaginative name to describe something wolfy, is it?
Percy continued.
Even I have a rudimentary, knowledge of the sagas. So as you can see, it was with little difficulty that we realized that you, my friend, are the werewolf.
I had to let this news sink into my mind. They seemed incredibly relaxed about this. Eventually, I smiled and I bowed. Why have you never mentioned this before, then? I asked.
Well, William, I, for one, would not want to spoil your idea that you had a little secret, would I?
Said Gervais.
Also, speaking for myself,
said Percy.
It was somewhat bloody useful. To be honest, it is amazing how certain things get done around you, and as part of your friendship group, myself, I have never felt a threat from you, and you are my friend. I feel safer in your company. So why would I mention it?
I stood there a little disappointed, I did, to be honest. I was afraid to offer my secret to my friends, but that secret had an element of excitement about it, and that had been robbed from me now, they knew. The only person who looked shocked and concerned was Welly. He seemed stunned and scared, he did. If he had the right intelligence, he may have thought that we were all making him a figure of fun. But the werewolf soul, Fenrir, came up alongside me to look at the men. He had no clue either that they knew what they knew. I think he was confused about this. He thought that he'd been extremely clever when hiding the facts from people. Not so, it seems. As the men sat, I introduced the soul that was beside me. I would have rested my arm on his shoulder if he'd been a physical creature, but as he was not, I could not. This is Fenrir. He is a werewolf soul from centuries ago. He is my friend and partner in this wicked world, he is. He is an unusual angel, but nonetheless, he is one. He does not have shiny wings or armor of gold. He is a dark angel in bestial form. The men looked at me and nodded. I'm afraid you cannot see him, but he is always here. He talks to me, he does. The men looked at me and nodded. I can see through his eyes and sense the world through his senses. The men looked at me and nodded. When it is necessary, we can come together and form a wolf or a werewolf. The men looked at me and nodded. This was all I really had to say, and I stood beaming at my friends who now knew everything, and they just seemed to accept it. How amazing these three were that they could allow such a strange and somewhat dark thing to exist, and not fear or hate it. The men looked at me, and they nodded. They were very relaxed now.
Show them, Will. For Peter's sake, so they believe all.
Sent the werewolf into my brain. I turned to him, smiled, returned to my audience, and raised my finger. My robe fell to the floor as I became a thick black mist that entered the wolf's soul. It filled that insubstantial body, pouring quickly into the spirit like fine wine fills a vessel. I opened my new eyes. The men had risen to their feet, and they shook. The reality of what I was now evident. It was not a talking point any longer. It was real. They could see it. Percy stood transfixed and seemed to be on the edge of flight. Gervais, brave Gervais, had his sword drawn and was in a pose of prepared violence, ready for the wolf's charge. Welly had both hands covering his face. He hid his eyes like a tiny child at the sight. He wanted to look, but he did not. So it was with some amusement that I saw his index finger and middle finger split from one another to cause a gap he could see through. The physical shock that this action gave sat him back on his seat with his face covered once again. I sniffed the ground and the air as reality sunk in. I loved the strong senses the wolf gave me. The freshness of this sight was slightly spoiled by the stench of horses and the stink of humans. They relaxed and released his sword, which fell back into its sheath. Percy relaxed. The grimace of fear I recognized on his face fell away as he felt comfort and confidence return to him.
William, you are, something quite something in that form.
He said. Oh, and how I was. Almost as large as a pony, I stood before them. Huge for a member of the wolf's world. My paws were the size of a draft horse's hoof. I would not be mistaken for a normal wolf or a foolish dog. What made me more frightening than my size was my pelt. Darker than the darkest of nights. It was the matte black of the sooted steel. It drew the light and swallowed it as it did so. It was difficult to see me, even on the brightest of days. If you did not look closely, I would have resembled nothing more than a shadow. Then, finally, there were my eyes. They burned. When I say that they burned, I tell no half-truth or falsehood. They burned. The pits that my eyes formed burned amber, and the flames of that burning were visible when we wished. I must have been terrifying to those before me. terrifying. The men looked at me and nodded. I then transformed into the Wolfman, 8 or 9 feet of muscle-bound humanoid, still shrouded in the matte black pelt, still with burning eyes. My muzzle was the size of a bull's, and it did not do so well at hiding those blade-like teeth that were in those powerful jaws. My hands were human. Hairier maybe, but human apart from the nails of said hands, being as they were, talons. Clawed they were with vicious spikes, each around 5 or 6 inches in length. I stood before them now, in my full magnificence. The men looked at me and nodded. Then I went back to the man. Oh, do not get me wrong, I am still a sight to see as a man. I am unfeasibly large in the population, broad of shoulder, strong of back, and regarded as something of a giant in this world. The men looked at me once more, and once more they nodded. Nothing was said as I got dressed and settled once more by the fire. Each was in a world of their own while they took on the camp's tasks. After an hour or so of work and contemplating over what they had seen, they all returned to the fire, which now roared and gave great warmth and comfort. It was marred with the facial lines of thought. I felt I had to break the silence, and as we were here for a certain task that would take us all to complete, I brought back the subject in hand, the tackling of the dragon. Time passed, and we sat and ate stale bread with some hard-rinded cheese, not out of hunger, you understand, but as something to do to counter our whirring minds.
So, Will, we know the truth of the situation. I mean, thanks for that, but how will that help us in our task? I still think the dragon in its fastness is impregnable as any well-fortified castle,
said Percy. I was about to agree. We needed something greater to help. But Welly, bless him, interrupted. A brave interruption for a mere boy.
Still have my cunning plan,
he voiced. We stopped our own quiet thoughts and looked at him. We knew the plan, but we had no idea how I, as a werewolf, would make that plan now applicable.
We're all ears, Welly. Some of us much more than others.
Gervais said, downing his 3rd draught of wine.
Have you heard of the Trojan horse?
He asked, as though we would never have heard of such a thing. Percy balked at this.
Well, as you know then, that horse contained soldiers who were taken into city walls. Those well-fortified walls that were supposedly sort of held siege for 40 years. Those soldiers in Thorstein went and sorted city from within. They opened the gates from the inside, negating the warriors on the wall.
He smirked and waited. I think he thought we would have understood his meaning as he filled his mouth with the last of his bread. We looked at him and nodded. But we wanted more from him. He looked confused for a moment, then continued with his story.
Well, we place our werewolf in Thorstein and let the dragon take it.
Again he grinned at his cleverness. We looked at him and shook our heads, not giving him the nods so frequently given this day.
So, let's get this right. Will be in his werewolf form and in the cave of the beast. He cannot take the beast, even if it were there by surprise. Its scales are too thick, they're like iron plates. How does he damage such? No, you misunderstand me, Gervais. You'd be taken into the cave, but you'd also be taken into the dragon.
He winked.
And then once he's in the dragon, he tears his way out.
We looked at one another. A boy, a wolf soul, and 3 men. This was ridiculous. I would certainly die. But it was the only plan we had before we would have to return in failure to Count and Lord. And so, I stand here with 2 other palfrey horses at the entrance of the cave. The other horses show fear at me. It is understandable, it is, as I am my wolf form by them. They are tethered, so they are forced to hold this spot, and we, together, are bait for the Wyrm. I wear a palfrey skin hide over myself to act as camouflage for what we attempt. We wait for the Wyrm to come snatch me. Once snatched, then, apparently, I will tear my way from the body of the beast like some hell-created birth, killing the creature. I suppose we will see.